Hello and welcome to Father Matt's Bible Studies and Sermons podcast. I'm Matthew Mead, the priest and rector at the Episcopal Parish of Christ the Redeemer in Pelham, New York. In today's episode, we continue our Bible study of the book of Daniel. Our class today will also include a previously recorded conversation from the Yale Bible Studies archive about Daniel by Professors Joel Baden and John Collins. Let's jump in. Let us pray. Almighty God, we ask your blessing on our Bible study this morning. Bless us as we celebrate Maundy Thursday today and begin the Easter Triduum, and give us a happy Easter and a blessed Holy Week. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we're starting with a video because they are going to introduce chapter 8 and 9 in Daniel. Last week we read chapter 7, which was the first of the apocalyptic chapters. And if you remember, there were 4 beasts coming out of the sea. The sea probably is an image of chaos and sort of pre-creation, non-creation kind of thing. If you think about that, it gets back into Genesis when there was just a bunch of water that needed to be separated. And the 4 beasts are different kingdoms. In chapter 8, which we will read after the video, there's a similar type of things with water and different sort of beasts, which we will see. But I think the video will help. So let me share.
After Daniel 7, Daniel 8 feels fairly similar. Again, we have some sort of body of water, in this case a river rather than a sea. Again, we have animals coming out of it. Maybe less frightening. They are more domestic kinds of animals, but still, we have a goat and a ram coming out, and what they feature as their most prominent sort of physical feature, at least the one that is interpreted, and this was true in the last chapter also, we just didn't get to it, is their horns. What's the significance of the animal's horns, both on the beasts in the last chapter and for the ram and the goat here?
Well, the horn symbolizes power. Mm-hmm. There are prayers that God would raise up the horn of David. And, it's a nice image, whether you think of a bull or you just say one horn, maybe you think of a unicorn, but it's something that could gore you. Now, the ram was traditionally associated with Persia, and you get this in the signs of the zodiac. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not clear whether that was fully developed by the time Daniel was written, but at least it corresponds. Mm-hmm. And the he-goat here is Alexander the Great. And there's a little humor in that, too. But now, to come back to what we skipped over in chapter 7, mm-hmm. the last beast in Daniel 7 was really a piece of work.
Yeah.
He was, and one of the things that he does is trample people with his feet. And mm-hmm. people think that this was inspired by the war elephants. Mm-hmm. The war elephants, were a novelty in the 2nd century BC, sure. and terrifying. The thought of being trampled by an elephant would put the fear of God into anybody.
Yeah.
Now, but this 4th beast also had, first of all, 10 horns.
Yeah.
Again, fairly freaky. Some people think the imagery of that came from a crown, where you had, little horns sticking up in it. In Daniel, it's supposed to mean there are 10 kings, and people have racked their brain to identify which 10 they're referring to. But I think, they just said 10 is a nice number.
Yeah.
There are plenty. But then there is a little horn that comes after that, which supplants the others. And it's this little horn, with the implication that this is an upstart who doesn't really belong in there. That's the one that turns out to symbolize Antiochus Epiphanes, the king who interfered with the cult in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and so that little horn appears both in 7 and in 8. Again, Antiochus, really a crucial figure in sort of the development of Judaism altogether. I mean, the Maccabean revolt, but of all of the sort of overlords from the Mesopotamians onward, really Antiochus so much antipathy toward him in Judaism, as really, I guess, beginning here in some sense.
I suppose we should fill in a little bit here on who Antiochus was and where he came out of.
Yeah.
You see, the world changed in the late 4th century BCE when Alexander the Great went on his campaigns all the way over to India.
Yeah.
And changed all that area. And then when he died, this was carved up among his generals. Mm-hmm. And for roughly 100 years, Judea was under the Ptolemies of Egypt. And nothing of great moment seems to have happened.
Yeah. That was okay.
Well, it was okay. There was a slave trade. It probably wasn't okay for everybody, but nothing worth rebelling against. Mm-hmm. And then in 198, the Syrians conquered that part. And the Syrian kings were all named either Antiochus or Seleucus. Mm-hmm. And now one of them was Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. He was the one who conquered Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And at first they welcomed him. It seemed to be all getting along great. There was no thought of rebelling against him. But he then got into trouble with the Romans. Mm-hmm. And the Romans demanded a heavy tribute. And from that time on, the Seleucids, as the kings of Syria were called, were constantly trying to find money to pay off the Romans. Yeah. And there's a story in the second book of Maccabees how they tried to get money out of the temple in Jerusalem. You know, if there are funds supposedly lying around, they belong to the king.
Sure.
That's the principle of it. Mm-hmm. So that put a strain on things. Now, when Antiochus IV came along in 175, he had been a hostage in Rome, but he had the same problems. Yeah. And you find very early on, a man named Jason went to him taking the tribute, and he said, you know, if you made me high priest, I'd get you a bigger tribute. And the king said, wonderful idea. Mm-hmm. You're high priest. Now, he goes back, and then a little later, somebody else gets to bring the tribute, a man named Menelaus, and he says to the king, I'll get you an even bigger tribute. And this is really what causes the friction in Jerusalem. Eventually, fighting breaks out between Jason and Menelaus, and then the king thinks they're rebelling against his authority, and he sends in the troops and puts them down hard. And that's what sets up this persecution. That's where Antiochus Epiphanes comes out of.
And this is where the Maccabean revolt comes in response to.
And the Maccabean revolt then comes in response to that. Because in part of his suppression of Jerusalem, he said, you can no longer keep your traditional laws. That means you can no longer observe your traditional cult. Mm-hmm. Forget the Passover, instead you celebrate my birthday. Yeah. You have a festival in honor of Dionysus. Well, this, was a bridge too far for most people. This is actually what pushed them to revolt. And it's for that reason that Antiochus Epiphanes is despised in a way that even Nebuchadnezzar was not.
Right. Although it's safe to say that it was really much more a sort of systemic problem for which he was just the crystallized embodiment. I mean, he was as bad as he gets when it comes to that. But you had Jews, Jason and Menelaus, who were already sort of starting to unravel what was the fabric of the long-standing fabric of society. You can see why, in that sense, we've talked about this before, why people would have looked at the time and thought, everything we've ever known is coming to an end here. I mean, the temple of all places is sort of collapsed into politics and money and then sort of been overrun by pagans. It must have been a very terrifying sort of thing.
Now, in Daniel chapter 8, the takeover of the temple is described as an assault on heaven.
Right.
That this little horn attacks the stars and knocks some of them to the ground and tramples on them. Mm-hmm. Well, this is figurative language, obviously, but what does it mean if he knocks down some of the host of heaven? In Daniel 7, it was said of the little horn that he will wear out the holy ones of the Most High. And some people have looked at this and says, but surely he couldn't wear out angels. But the point is that he could. That's what they're saying, that he actually succeeded in storming heaven for a while.
Yeah.
And was getting right up there, close to the Most High himself. And then he is struck down by no human hand, is the way it's put. This is an old myth. You know, it's Lucifer, son of dawn, Hail Al Ben Shakar, in the Hebrew Bible, the one who tries to rise above the stars of Ale, above the stars of God, and is cast down.
The next chapter, after 8, chapter 9, is in some ways quite different. It uses some this sort of apocalyptic interpretation, but it really harkens back to sort of many more traditional elements of sort of biblical thought. We get almost Deuteronomistic concepts and language. There's punishment for not obeying the Torah. There's all sorts of stuff, and there is most notably explicit reinterpretation of earlier clearly biblical material. Most notably, famously, Daniel seems to pick up the book of Jeremiah, and in which he reads that it will be 70 years between the exile and the restoration, and Daniel is now living well past that point. And that prophecy is not so good for him anymore.
Now, of course, if you believed the literal framework of the book of Daniel, he would still be within the 70 years,
right?
I think. So, it only becomes a problem. If you pick it up and says, Jerusalem will be desolate for 70 years, what's so problematic about that? What's so obscure? Well, it's only obscure if you're living a couple of hundred years later and Jerusalem is desolate again.
Right.
And that's the problem, really, from the viewpoint of Daniel. And so he prays, and an angel comes to explain it to him. To give the angel time to get there, he recites a long prayer. And the prayer, isn't a great fit for the context. It's not a prayer for enlightenment. It's a typical prayer, we have sinned, we have done wrong, kind of standard Deuteronomic theology. But when the angel gets there, he says, Daniel, I set out as soon as I got the message. None of this stuff applies. All of this is predetermined. What this really means, 70 years means 70 weeks of years.
Well, that's convenient.
To which you say, but of course, right? Why should 70 years mean 70 weeks of years? Well, you see, the assumption is that everything is mysterious. Nothing really means what it is. If you see a ram and a he-goat, it's not a ram and a he-goat, it's two kings. If you see somebody that looks like a man on the clouds of heaven, the one thing you know is it's not a man. And if Jeremiah says 70 years, it doesn't really mean 70 years.
What is I think so important about this is not just the math. It's that you can see, even within the Bible itself, you can see interpreters taking plain words and making them mean something that is totally different but is relevant to their own time.
That's right.
And this is, when we have people still today who say literal, literal, literal for how to understand the Bible, we have people in the Bible themselves who are not treating the text that way, who recognize that it is there to be made relevant in whatever way you can.
Yes.
Right?
Now, you may say 70 weeks of years, and then what? Now, the question that runs through all of the second half of Daniel is, how long is the temple going to be desolate? How long is the temple going to be desecrated? And what they typically come down to is 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a time. In Daniel 7, in Daniel 8. Now, in the 70 weeks of years, you go over 69 of those weeks very, very fast. And then the attention focuses on the last week. You can recognize what's happening in the first half of the last week, A high priest gets killed, for example. The temple is desecrated. And then it's the last half week or 3.5 years is supposed to be how long it's going to be until the temple is set right. Now, but of course, in later interpretation, when the temple was long gone, people said this must be until the end of the world. And for the last 1,000 years or so, people have regularly reinterpreted Daniel's numbers to come up with a new date for the end of the world. Famous one in Ohio in the 1840s called the Millerites. A man named William Miller, a farmer, got to speculating on this, and people pressed him on it, and so he decided it would be on some date in October of 1843.
Right.
And so his followers sold their belongings and assembled on a hill. And the sun came up again the next morning.
And here we are today.
And here we are today. And so eventually some of his followers went off and became the Seventh-day Adventists. But just a couple of years ago, we had a man named Harold Camping who did the math again and decided it was going to be some date in August, was it 2012, 11 or 12, something like that. Camping at least had the honesty afterwards to say, well, I guess I was wrong.
Yeah.
But he was probably the first interpreter ever to admit that he was wrong.
I mean, I think one of the interesting features of these chapters is that Daniel has gone from the person who interprets everyone else's dreams to someone who receives visions and requires interpretation of them himself. He needs, he sees vision and says, I don't know what to do with this. And down comes an angel. It's a very, it's taking the same themes, but just, turning them into this new, this new genre. And again, it's saying something about how interpretation works, not just how revelation works, but how interpretation works, I think.
Indeed. And he's much easier to identify with, I think, in the second half of the book.
Right.
Lots of people have read these visions and said, I don't know what the hell this means. So
we are going to get to, I think, the most dramatic of them in the last 3 chapters of Daniel, which we'll do in our next session.
Alrighty. Let's see. Can you hear me? Am I back? Okay. So a couple of things. One, they gave a little bit of a history lesson in the middle of that about the Maccabees and Antiochus Epiphanes. And I think so that you have it and can actually know where this thing is, it would help us to read the first chapter of the Maccabees today. Has anybody ever read the Maccabees? So there are 4 books of the Maccabees, and 2 of them are in the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical parts of the Bible, and therefore they're not in the Jewish Bible. But they are in the Catholic Bible, they are in our Apocrypha, and they are in the Greek Orthodox Bible. And then there's 2 other books of the Maccabees, conveniently called 3rd and 4th Maccabees, which are extra beyond that. And the Maccabees, whether or not you know about the Maccabees, you do certainly know something that came out of that, which is Hanukkah. The Hanukkah celebration is rooted in the Maccabee revolt and the rededication of the temple. And so one of the things I want to do right now is just read the first chapter of the Maccabees. I think that will give you an actually pretty good overview of the time period that we're probably talking about, and Antiochus Epiphanes, and who he was and why he was so bad. All right? So I'm going to share. And okay, can you see my screen? I hope. Okay, Carrie, can you read this first chunk? This is a fairly long chapter, all the way, the whole Alexander the Great section.
Okay. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and slaughtered the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they paid him tribute. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers, who had been brought up with him from youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth.
Great. Okay, so this is Alexander the Great. That's pretty obvious. I think it's helpful, though, to have seen the Persians and the Medes are in our Daniel story, right? Like they were in the first part of this. And when we suddenly changed gears to this future-looking time, part of the reason we're reading this, and I think this will be helpful, is that pretty much every scholar will tell you this is probably the time that we're talking about. And almost certainly this is the time we're talking about. And you can take it from two different perspectives. You can take it from the perspective that Daniel is prophesying this off into the future, or you can take it from the perspective which our two professors do, which is that this is going on right now when Daniel is being written. So either way, it doesn't really matter, but the history is the same, if that makes sense. JD, can you read these two Antiochus chunks?
From them came forth a sinful root, and Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, he had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the nations around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us." This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the nations. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the customs of the nations, and made foreskins for themselves and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the nations and sold themselves to do evil.
Keep going.
When Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, in order that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants and cavalry, and then with a large fleet. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and many were wounded and fell. They captured the fortified city in the land of Egypt, and he plundered the land of Egypt.
Okay, the key here is this section. So Antiochus Epiphanes is the son of King Antiochus. You may or may not have heard of the Seleucid dynasty. That's what they are. It's this root of kings after Alexander the Great. It's several generations down. And the problem of what he does is right here. It's renegades came out from Israel to mislead them, basically saying, if you know the language here, let's make a covenant with the nations, right? They're supposed to have a covenant with the Lord. And so they're leaving God, and they build a Greek gymnasium, which, if you know what a Greek gymnasium was, it was a lot of naked men working out. And they made foreskins for themselves, is some sort of surgery that they're doing to themselves, and they abandon the covenant. And then Antiochus tries to take over other areas, and they sort of do. Let's keep going. Charlotte, can you read the persecution of the Jews chunk?
Okay. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus turned back in the 143rd year and went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He took also the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame.
Great. Okay. I don't know I don't know the text well enough, but I've always found it somewhat coincidental that he is described in the Maccabees as being arrogant. And if you remember Daniel, there's an arrogant horn who everybody seems to think is Antiochus Epiphanes. And he plunders the temple. Barbara, can you read this next occupation of Jerusalem section?
2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. They took captive the women and children and seized the livestock. Then they fortified the city of David and a large, strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful nation, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem. They stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. Because of them, the residents of Jerusalem fled. She became a dwelling of strangers. She became strange to her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became desolate like a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into a reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory. Her exaltation was turned into mourning.
Great. Okay. Jim, can you read the next two paragraphs?
Oh, yes, certainly. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom, and all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the nations accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He described them to follow customs. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the holy ones, to build altars and sacrifice and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Go on. Yeah. Now, on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offerings. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the books of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel.
Matt, you're muted.
That gives you some background on this, and I don't know, does anyone have any questions or comments on it at all? It gets worse as you go through. They start replacing the priests, and there's bribes involved, and the high priest gets assassinated, and these different things go on. I think this helps to give some sense of what it seems to have been like. The temple has been overrun with other worship of other gods and strange sacrifices, and the leadership of the temple is involved in it, is sort of what is going on. And so this turns into a revolt, which is known as the Maccabean revolt, and they eventually end up taking over. But this gives you an idea of how bad it was. And if we jump to Daniel 8.
Matthew?
Yes.
I just know that when we talked about the Maccabees, when we're talking about, we talk about religion, yes, public school, but when we are recognizing others, we do talk about Hanukkah, we do talk about Christmas, we do talk about whatever holidays are being celebrated around that time. We don't go through this whole thing. Young children, I don't think need to hear all of this, but we do talk about the fact that the Israelites seem to have won out in the end. And that's how this 8 candles, it seems though the oil to burn the lamp was only supposed to last 1 day, but it lasted 8. And so that's how they're celebrating Hanukkah. So it's interesting to hear this. Yes, these Maccabees are terrible.
No, the Maccabees are the ones that revolted. The Maccabees are the ones that revolted. They were.
But what was happening to them, and that's right, what was happening was really amazing. So we didn't talk about that, but we did talk about the fact that this oil lasted for 8 days, and that's why Hanukkah is celebrated for the 8 days.
You can read the whole. I would recommend it. It's the same type of reading, so it's violent history. And if you read First and Second Maccabees, they're sort of two takes on the same story. First Maccabees is more of a narrative, and Second Maccabees is more of a first-person account of things. I think by Jason or maybe by somebody, but it's I haven't read it in a little bit. But you can read it, and it does give you the background of where Hanukkah comes from, and doesn't give you all of the traditions and everything that's there. But it is the historical sort of background to it. And the Maccabees run into similar problems where they start installing their own priests as well, and that becomes a different problem. But on your own, read it, and let's just keep that in mind for the stage that is set. And for what it's worth, Hanukkah would not have yet happened. That's after what we're seeing.
Right, yeah.
We're in all the bad stuff right now.
Right, exactly.
So, okay, chapter 8, just jump back. In chapter 7, we were in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. In chapter 8, now we're a couple of years later. Carrie, can you read the first 2 paragraphs?
Sure. Vision of a ram and a goat. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. In the vision, I saw myself in Susa, the capital in the province of Elam, and I was by the Ulai gate. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the gate. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the gate, and it ran at it with savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven.
Great. Okay. The convenient thing about Daniel, and the professors alluded to this is completely opaque and totally confusing. And Daniel is having this vision, and conveniently an angel will tell us exactly what it means lower down for the most part. A couple of things that help. Susa is the capital. It says that will come up later. Elam is the province where Susa is. The Ulai is a river, so there's a gate by this river. The angel will tell us that the ram is to symbolize 2 kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians, and the 2 horns are the 2 different kingdoms themselves. And they start fighting with a goat who will eventually symbolize Alexander the Great and the Greek kingdom. And the different horns that come off of that goat are the kingdoms that Alexander's kingdoms breaks up into. Any comments or questions on these first 2 paragraphs? All right. JD, can you read section 9, this next paragraph?
Out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled?" And he answered him, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state."
Okay. So from the goat, which is the Greek kingdom, Alexander the Great, 4 horns come out. His kingdom was divided into 3 parts. I think one of them is supposed to be him, and the other 3 are the kingdoms. And then out of one of those horns, and so if you can envision it, a horn, and sort of a horn is coming out of a horn, it's new generations and new lines of kings coming out in these areas. And so this little horn, and that was the same line used in the last chapter, probably is Antiochus Epiphanes. If it's not, that's okay. It's some king at some point. And the issue that he's going to have is that he's going to build himself up as high as heaven, and the things he does on earth are going to be problematic in heaven. It says right here, he threw down to earth some of the host, that's the host of heaven, and some of the stars, and trampled on them. So what is it that he's doing? He's defiling the temple and the sanctuary, and that is causing problems in heaven, and so he needs to get thrown down as well. And then we get our one of our wonderful Daniel datings here. Earlier we had the time and a half and things like that, or 2 times and a time and a half. Now we have 4,300 evenings and mornings. That equates to a little more than 6.5 years, give or take. It's about 6.5 years. And so at some point, this is going to last for less than 7 years, which gets into this weeks of years that we'll see later. Any questions on this? Okay. Let's have Gabriel interpret the vision, which will help. James, can you read? I don't know if you can get all the way to the end. Can you start at 15 and go through the poem, and I'll scroll a little bit as we go?
Okay. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the Ulai calling, Gabriel, help this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end. As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall rise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning, he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evening, of the morning, that has been told is true. As for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now.
Great. Okay. So this is the interpretation of the vision, and it's about these different kingdoms. Again, he describes that the ram is the Medes and the Persians. He describes that the goat is the king of Greece, who is Alexander the Great, and that other kings will come up after him, but not with his power. They're not going to be as great as he is. And then there's going to arise another king, who's that little horn, and he will grow strong in power and be very destructive. And what he does will be problematic even to the people of the holy ones. And he's going to prosper, and this is going to happen for a while, but eventually he will be broken, and not by human hands, which means God will strike him down. And these are the visions that Daniel has, and it's going to happen many days from now. And I'll read the last verse. So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it. So even though he's had this, it makes him sick, which is kind of interesting. But it gives you, I think, having read the Maccabees, I think part of the idea here is that this is being written and read at a time when it's really, really bad, and the religion is seemingly collapsing because the temple has kind of collapsed, and the promise to Jerusalem is there's no king that they can recognize, and it's really terrible. But this terrible time will eventually end, but it's going to happen. And that's, I think, often why Daniel is read by people is again and again, because they think, oh, the time we're in right now looks a lot like this, and so when is this going to end? And as the professor said, it gets projected to the end of the world, which people that have attempted to track that date down, and we'll get more into dates in the next chapters, have generally not been successful, to say the least. Any comments on this chapter? Okay. We will continue next week on chapter 9. I do want to note one thing on 9 before we go, is they did mention in the video that Daniel seems to have a copy of the book of Jeremiah, and it's right here. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, by birth a Mede, who became king over the realm of the Chaldeans, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, must be fulfilled for the devastation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So when we look at this next week, he's starting with this book. And again, the timeline is interesting. If he's got a copy of Jeremiah and other books, what does this mean in terms of our timeline? Because Jeremiah and Daniel are somewhat contemporaneous on the literal timeline. But he seems to have it. And again, also, why would he care that it's 70 years if he's living in the middle of it? The professors talked a little bit about this. If the 70 years haven't come up yet and things are bad now, then why are you worried that the 70 years is that Jeremiah prophesied 70 years and that didn't seem right, if that makes sense. So we'll deal with that next week. I hope all you're coming tonight to the Monday, Thursday dinner. If not, I will see you at some other point. And the dinner's at 6. The service is at 7:30. Good Friday is at noon. Easter Eve is 7:30 p.m. and Easter Day is 9 a.m. and 11:15. Any final
Matt,
thoughts? Yes.
just final thought. As we look at this and we say that Daniel's having visions, but when I look at these creatures that come to his mind, that sounds like a nightmare to me. I mean, just reading it was frightful. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm picturing this. I'm like, this is awful. The other thing is I do want to say too, and commend, not that our services haven't been good, but I will say that the Palm Sunday service was wonderful. It really, I'm saying, just looking at everybody who took part in whatever way they took part, it just made a very uplifting time and really made us think. It was good to see some of the young people out that hadn't been out for a while. So
Yeah.
just, compliments to all for very spiritual and, just a discerning time. It was really wonderful. Very, very nice.
Thank you. On behalf of all, thank you. I would add or follow up on what you said. The vision makes Daniel sick, so he's not happy with it either.
Oh, I could understand that.
Yeah, it makes him sick, and he's still, even after getting the interpretation, he's still confused. And it's yet another strange vision. It continues like this for another couple of chapters, and by the end of it, I hope that you'll have a better understanding of why people use Daniel in really challenging times to try to explain how bad things are and that things may get better at some point. But it's going to take divine intervention. That's sort of the point. So, all right. God bless you. Have a good Monday, Thursday, and I'll see you all later.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. If you're interested in joining the Bible study each week, please visit christchurchpelham.org and click on Rector's Bible Study. We meet each week on Zoom, so you can join in anywhere. Additionally, you can listen to each week's Bible study and sermons on Apple Podcasts. search for and follow Father Matt's Bible Studies and Sermons podcast on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you haven't already done so, please follow or like our Christ Church Pelham YouTube channel. God bless and have a great day.